Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be actually going to part two of our little mini-series on risk oversight. And today, we're going to talk about how to oversee third-party risk. And joining me is Carolyn Holcomb, who's the privacy assurance leader and cybersecurity and ESG partner for PwC. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So when we mention third-party risk, I think the most important place for us to start probably is to make sure that people can identify what third-party risk is, particularly when we're talking about areas of privacy and cybersecurity. So can you give us sort of some examples that sort of bring third-party risk to life?
So third parties, also known as vendors for this topic, present privacy and cybersecurity risks to organizations because companies engage vendors, and when they do that, they share data with vendors. And when they share that sensitive information, the companies really need to understand how those vendors are protecting that data. So in a recent PwC survey, 85% of respondents said they see their risk third parties increasing. In fact, in that same survey, over 1/3 of respondents said they have already experienced a significant disruption due to one of those third parties. So one example that might be familiar to most board members is SolarWinds. The SolarWinds incident in 2020 was one of the biggest breaches of this century. In that situation, suspected nation-state hackers gained access to the networks, systems, and data of thousands of its customers. More than 30,000 organizations use SolarWinds to manage their IT resources. As a result, that hack compromised the data, networks, and systems of thousands of people. Another example comes from a Fortune 100 company that suffered a damaging breach when an unauthorized party accessed an email account of a vendor. So it came from a third party directly. That account contained substantial personal data, including bank account numbers, passport numbers, and more. And that breach included over 200,000 current and former employees' information, including benefits and personal health information. And despite the prevalence of these types of incidents, in our recent PwC survey, only 54% of respondents said their organization has a program to manage their vendors. So that's really what we're talking about here.
So my guess is that most board members would be surprised at the amount and the number of people that are able to interact with the sensitive data, in a company. So maybe you can emphasize again, and you sort of did in your explanations on why it's critical, but more importantly, how should a company protect itself?
Right. And just to emphasize, I think it's really critical for two reasons. Number one, that I really talked about, a company's brand and reputation are on the line. Most consumers will remember that they trusted a company with their data. They're typically not aware of that third-party vendor. So a problem or an incident or a breach at a vendor really becomes the company's problem. But secondly, there is a trend in which regulators increasingly care about this topic. In our PwC survey, 92% of businesses see regulatory scrutiny of third parties increasing. Regulators are getting more vocal when there are these big attacks. In fact, about half the states in the US have now implemented reasonable security practice requirements into their regulations. And vendor management is a critical component of a reasonable security and privacy program. As an example, the new Virginia privacy law recommends that companies consider third-party assurance over vendor privacy and security programs. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. In order for a company to best protect itself, it should first ensure that it has an accurate and complete inventory of all the third parties with whom it shares data. I think board members might be surprised that many organizations haven't figured out this inventory. Next, the company should ensure it performs 4 key steps for all of their third parties. Number 1, protect yourself contractually. Number 2, perform upfront due diligence before you engage a vendor. Number 3, perform ongoing monitoring of that third party. And then number 4, when you're done with that vendor, make sure that the vendor securely disposes of all the data that was shared.
So I'd like to dig a little deeper into some of those steps, and particularly when you talk about sort of doing a due diligence and then obviously monitoring going forward has to be a big issue. So what should companies be doing more specifically with those areas?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, start with the contract, but in the contract, add a requirement for independent assurance, such as a SOC 2, that's SOC and then the number 2, over privacy and security. This assurance is a normal, valid request. There's no downside to making it. And many organizations include it already, but if you don't have it, I strongly recommend that you add it. Number 2, a SOC 2 report is something that the vendor will provide to you. Just to explain a little bit so that everybody's clear on what it is, the report tells you how the privacy and security programs are built and how well they are run. Because these reports are provided by an independent party, you get unvarnished insights into how the program is really running and whether it's operating effectively to protect the data that you've shared. These reports can be tailored to your needs and to the vendor's environment, and the vendor typically pays for them. So there should be no cost or risk to the company. Some companies also ask their vendors to complete questionnaires. While these can be effective for certain questions, they don't come with any verification. So that's the advantage of the SOC 2 that you've asked for now in your contract. Some companies also go on site and perform their own audits of their vendors. This process can be effective if a more hands-on approach is desired, but we recommend that you first request that SOC 2 and see how many of your questions are already addressed, because they would also be verified. Then your on-site audit can be more effective and more pointed.
So let's get to the meat of this. So if I'm a board member, what questions should I be asking of the management team about our third-party relationships and who is actually monitoring them on the team?
So if I were a board member, here are the top 3 questions I would ask my management team. Number 1, does management have an accurate and complete list of all the vendors with whom it shares sensitive data? Number 2, how is management initially determining and then monitoring the privacy and cybersecurity risks at each vendor? And then number 3, is management requiring the SOC 2 in its contract with every vendor with whom it shares this data? And when it receives that report, is management reading it, evaluating it, and understanding those results in a timely manner so that they can be addressed and any risks identified can be assessed?
Is there anything else that we want to leave on this topic with the viewers related to third-party risk? Again, this is an area that I think is not probably talked about as much as it should, in risk, but it certainly has been the source of some of the most major breaches.
Right, well said. This is an area that probably needs more discussion because there's so much risk. So in summary, I'd say outsourcing is growing. So third parties are being used more and more. Therefore, that leads to increased privacy and cybersecurity risk. So the vendors with whom you share data really need a lot of monitoring. Independent assurance, such as a SOC 2, is the most effective way to perform that monitoring for 3 reasons. Number 1, the assurance is independent, so there's no bias, everything's verified. Number 2, a SOC 2 provides transparency about the vendor's privacy and security program, so you'll gain new insights into those programs. And number 3, the organization's compliance cost will be reduced, since you won't have to design and wade through so many questionnaire responses or perform so many on-site audits. And TK, I'll leave you with one last thought. To draw an analogy, companies have independent annual audits of their financial statements by reputable firms. Why wouldn't you do the same to address the reputational and financial risks that are being presented by your vendors?
That's a fair question to ask, but I'm sure that this has, they're not on equal level, even though once somebody has a breach, I'm sure they feel very differently going forward. So it's better to be on the front end and learn from others on this than to be caught on the back end and either, pay some kind of ransom or whatever it might be. So Carolyn, I want to thank you for taking the time to update our viewing audience on third-party risk. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.